Good morning, evening, afternoon, whatever it is where everybody is. Um, we're still waiting for people to slowly trickle in, but just so we're not wasting time, I will launch right in. I want to welcome everyone to what I hope will be a very enriching discussion at a very timely moment. Before I forget, I was just reminded that it would be great if, as people join, they could introduce themselves in the chat. As a Teams meeting, we have both a chat box and a Q&A. So feel free to throw your questions into the Q&A. If you're like me and not very technologically savvy and you can't work out how to do that, just put them in the chat and we will find you. So feel free. Just by way of a quick introduction, my name is Meg Sattler and I am the CEO of Ground Truth Solutions, and I have the very privileged task of leading us through a conversation with some very bright minds today. We have Patrick Gathara, Talatu Adiwu, Peter Kitty and Fanta Toure, all of whom I will introduce properly in a moment. For those of you who don't know us, Ground Truth is an organisation that has been speaking to people impacted by crisis for the past 15 years or so, and more importantly than that, working with them to ensure that their views, opinions and experiences are driving humanitarian and climate action with varying degrees of success. I feel that setting the scene for a chat like this is quite hard. And I could probably say the standard things that everyone is putting in the front of their reports about how there is growing need and more crisis and less money. But I guess that quite quickly feels like a lot of numbers and like quite a system-centric view. So I might not do that here. I think I should give you the caveat that there will be some data today, but I hope that this session will bring out more of the human side of things, you know, the good and the bad. I think we need to recognise that humans do terrible things and that is underlying so much of the mess that we currently find ourselves in. But humans also create and repair, and you see creativity everywhere in hardship. Many of you have heard me ranting about AI, and it's not because I hate technology. It's more because I really believe in human creativity. And more than that, I think we need that most at times like this. Last night in Vienna, where Ground Truth is headquartered, we had an event and we were joined by a poet called Lorenz South, who is a Congolese poet based in Austria. And we had initially reached out to her because I had found her poem online about the hidden nature of what she calls a silent genocide in DRC. And I don't think any data or any numbers could replace her words when she says, even by the way bombs fall from the skies, you would have thought it were unhurried rain, calming the thirst of a fiery ground. I think when we look for it, we find creative ways to understand the world. And everywhere we also see creative ways that people are working to right the wrongs of the world at the moment. Just before this, I was reading Al Jazeera, and there was a story about how communities were responding to the latest Israeli attacks in Lebanon. And there was this really lovely story of a community kitchen that had learnt to cook biryani for the Bangladeshi residents who were coming to the Lebanese community kitchen. And they were so happy when they found out that they were getting positive reviews on their cooking. And I feel like sometimes the way we talk about humanitarian aid and we quantify everything, and it really misses that human complexity. I think it also sometimes tries to present humanitarian actors as a sort of unified front of saviours. And I guess anyone who is brave enough to wade into the known conflict zone of the Western LinkedIn province knows that is absolutely not the case. And I think as we meet today, we see humanitarian actors actually really divided. There was a lot of anger that I saw following the statement that was put out by the IESC principals on the Middle East. There seems to be a bit of a a battle between those who are clinging to a top-down system of yesteryear and those who are sort of building new ones. There also seems to be quite a rift between people who are calling for justice and those who feel that maybe that is not the humanitarian role. And I feel like, these are not simple things. And to try to better understand what might work best in a certain place, I suppose our default is always to turn to people living these crises, and community experiences don't often fit very neatly into boxes, as hopefully we'll be able to convey through our report presentation. But I think if we're not going to listen to people as our first task, then we can't probably fully claim to be humanitarians. So with that, I want to welcome everyone to our report launch. I just want to quickly check with my colleague, my first faux pas of the day. Are we starting with the poem or the report, Pam?
With the poem, I'm going to share it right away.
Perfect. So we're going to start with the poem. The poem is by Peter Kiddy, who we're fortunate to have joining us today. Peter is a poet, a writer, a reader, and an activist who is currently based in the Kakuma refugee camp. We will play the poem that we've secured a pre-record of just because the connectivity may be a little bit dodgy. And then we'll be able to hear a little bit from Peter about why he wrote it and what he wants us to take away from it.
The language of denial for Al-Fasir. They call it clashes. They call it unrest. They call it a conflict situation. But we have seen the color of the soil change. We know what burnt flesh sounds like when the wind carries it past our names. They say the parties must practice restraint. Restrain? When children are buried in courtyards? Restrain? When a mother's voice is the only thing left searching the rubble. They say the situation is concerning, but concern does not dig graves. Concern does not stop the sky from swallowing our homes. From Addis to Geneva, statements bloom in soft diplomatic English, like flowers planted on unmarked graves, careful not to offend the killers. They measure words, not wounds. They weigh genocide on a gold scale before letting it fall from their tongues. The satellite have already spoken. They have seen what silence cannot hide. A city erased frame by frame, its screams pixelated in orbits. And still the world drafts another resolution, another gentle sigh, across a continent bleeding beneath polite sentences. Call it what it is. Call it by its true name, before even the ashes forget how to speak.
We might need a moment to sit with that, but as we're digesting it, I wanted to send a warm welcome to Peter Kiddy, who has managed to secure enough connectivity to chat to us today. Peter, you've been sort of someone who has become quite known for your very moving and biting sometimes poems about the sort of lived experiences that you have and the way that you experience humanitarian aid. I'm just wondering, what was it that led you to write that poem, and what would you want us all to take away from it? I think you're muted.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy, and this is a privilege to be part of this conversation. So sometime when we heard of the situation in Sudan, and later the situation Fasil. So in the camp asked so many people from different African countries, and we also have Sudanese here. And I managed to connect with some of my Sudanese friends, trying to reflect on the situation back home. And finally, we managed to connect with some people in Sudan so that we try and understand what was happening then. Then during that time, I managed to write 2 poems. The first poem was The City of the Forgotten. Then I later wrote another poem after the killing, of how the world was responding to what happened to the victims of the killing in Al-Fasir. And as a result, I wrote The Language of Denial. And I was really shocked by how we use soft language to try and soften suffering, or now even when we're regarding to real people who are suffering, who are losing everything that they hold dear, and we try and put it into boxes. And I became shocked with the risk of us, I mean, playing with language and sort of saying that the situation is a conflict situation, and yet we're losing lives. Or now, if we allow this happen, then we are taking part in silencing voices. We are taking part in making sure that the genocide continues. Or now, even the institution that we thought could have condemned what was happening, be it the African Union, and later what was spoken in Geneva, was totally off in regards to what was happening. So I was really happy that I was able to become part of that documentation, to making sure that the lives lost are not just forgotten, but remembered in beautiful pieces of art, though they are painful to swallow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for grounding our conversation with such a sort of stark picture of things. If those of you want to connect with Peter after this, he's on LinkedIn, and I'm sure would value a conversation with more of you. Slightly less poetic, I'm now going to run us through the findings of our global report. I will try to do so in the same spirit of humanity. I'm going to sort of blitz through it. It's a bit difficult to distill conversations with 14,000 people into a series of slides to present in 3 minutes. So a lot of nuance is going to be probably lost on the slides, but I will do my best. So this is a synthesis report that we put together based on all of the work that we did, all of the analysis in 2025. We spoke to 14,000 people across 12 countries, as well as conducting key informant interviews, primarily with local actors, but also with some people working on the sort of power shifting train. All of this work was possible due to dozens of partners and thousands of people. So as I run through it, I'll try to sort of give the headlines for what was quite a sort of complex analysis. But hopefully what it does is provide some food for thought for the conversation that will follow. If we go to the next slide. So last year obviously was the year when the US government took a quote unquote wood chipper to humanitarian assistance. Some governments had already started to do that and other governments followed. We, working with a number of partners, did some qualitative interviews quite soon after that to see whether or not the implications of that were already being felt. I think we saw a lot of sort of feelings of abandonment and confusion. Aid cuts seemed to be rapidly impacting food and health and sort of basic needs. They were also reducing trust in aid workers very quickly, as well as pointing to some immediate fears about harmful coping mechanisms, as you see on this slide, also security risks, and that included fears of people, particularly young people, joining armed groups to survive and things like that. So we were quite surprised by how quickly that was felt at the community level, and I know that that will feature in some of the conversation that we're about to have. In terms of prioritisation, so this was obviously a big year for prioritisation. I will say from the outset that our data probably didn't fully capture a lot of prioritisation decisions on a large scale that were sort of made under the guise of hyper-prioritisation. I think those will be probably start to be felt more in 2026 and beyond. But I will say that particularly from the key informant interviews, there was a sense that there was a massive chasm between humanitarian and community prioritisation. If we go to the next slide, we looked into whether or not aid was reaching the right people, which is something that GTS has focused on for a long time. As you can see here from this quite crude graph, I think the picture on whether aid reaches the right people is quite mixed, obviously quite bad here in Sudan and in Afghanistan. There was a lot of talk last year and this year of the HNRP process tightening, which saw a lot of people who would have been recognised as being sort of in need reduced between 2023 and 2025. We saw throughout the course of our data collection a real sense that hard to reach and rural populations were starting to be disproportionately cut off. In Sudan and Afghanistan, obviously nearly 2/3 of people say that aid does not reach those who need it most. Those flagged to be missing out tend to include older people, people with disabilities, single mothers, and often host community members in hosting situations of displacement. There were real perceptions of corruption and unfairness, particularly high in Gaza, Sudan, Afghanistan, but honestly, we sort of see this everywhere. And that's definitely made worse by poor communication. So when people don't understand how decisions are being made, I think corruption is sort of the natural belief. And finally, what we saw here is that people very often redistribute aid themselves according to either their own assessments of who is in need and who isn't, or just their own community-based prioritisation. When it comes to delivering the right assistance, again, quite a mixed picture here. Hearing from people, we heard a lot about how hyper-prioritisation is seen often as kind of a back to basics survival package, you know, food, water, health, shelter. But there is often quite a large gap between what's delivered and what people say they need. That changes sometimes based on a particular situation and the time that we speak to people in. But overall, I would say that's a gap that tends to be widening. And I think an interesting thing, rather than maybe looking at all the green and red, is just an example that we have here from Gaza. Excuse the typo that we have on the graph. But you can see here when we ask people what their most important needs are versus the assistance that they receive, almost undoubtedly here in Gaza, but probably everywhere, it's quite different. We also see very often communities sort of consistently asking for cash, and something that is changing on that front with hyper-prioritisation is that people sort of seem newly hesitant to give out cash in the current hyper-prioritisation moment. I think some funders are definitely promoting it, but others seem to have sort of stepped back a little bit, which is slightly worrying just based on 15 years of our own data. And also that the cuts seem to be stripping away things that are sort of seen as extras, but they include things like protection and the prevention of gender-based violence, education, And these are things that are not only obviously important, but that we see that communities themselves tend to prioritize a lot. And I've got a quote here from Nigeria. The system is shifting from thinking about quality of life, about what it means to be fully human, to just enabling survival. And I think while we all understand the trade-offs that have to be made, I don't think that is what anyone sort of wants to see from a humanitarian system. I think where it starts to get a bit more interesting is in precarity and aid dependency. So this has been obviously a long-standing ground truth talking point. The more that we speak to people about aid, the more their answer is, we don't want aid. We want to be people who aren't aid recipients, and we want support that enables us to do that if we're going to get support at all. I think the whole hyper-prioritization moment that we're in is really dangerous for this, and we found ourselves in some quite intense and heated arguments with various humanitarian actors and coordinators about whether we really have a right to be sharing information like this at a time when there's just not enough money and everything has to be scaled back. But what we always say, and what a lot of communities themselves will say, is that things like recovery, livelihoods, resilience, education, these are considered life-saving by most people who are living through crises. There was an amazing discussion that we had with an education minister in Palestine who said you can't possibly see education as not life-saving when we feel that our whole existence is being threatened. Like, our future is our children and their education. And I think we all need to really check ourselves if we sort of try and dim that narrative that, you know, no one would ever dim that for themselves. If we go to the next one on climate change, so we've been looking a lot more into climate impacts of crises. The more that we talk to people about that, the more the picture is honestly quite bleak. I think climate impacts are really stark. They intersect with conflict, they intersect with poverty. There was a moment, I think, where climate change was sort of a big deal in humanitarian circles, but a lot of that feels like it's rolling back because of the funding cuts. There is still somewhat of a focus, it seems, on anticipatory action, but certainly resilience, I think, has become a bit of a taboo word in a lot of humanitarian rooms, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Fanta's take on that a bit later. But I guess the point is, from the community perspective, climate shocks are not just more frequent, they're also sort of changing in nature and becoming more and more complex, less predictable. And people are really calling for support to deal with climate shocks, but are just not getting that support, which sort of means there's a bit of a false economy in humanitarian assistance because all it can be is a kind of patch up. We look, obviously being ground truth, at communities driving decision making. As usual, not the most positive data set. There was a lot of rhetoric in the humanitarian reset about the reset being people-centered, rooted in communities. But if anything, I think the more that we talk to people, the more that community engagement as an activity, rightly or wrongly, seems to have been one of the first things to be scaled back. There's a lot less even rhetoric about it, I would say, at the global level, as someone who's been sort of tracking this agenda for a long time. And there's a lot more, I think, frustration at the community level, because people tell us, you know, they're doing stuff, they have ideas, and they're just not being heard, which then leads to a lot of money that is being wasted with bad programming, or just programming that is not necessarily what people want or need. And there's quite a stark example here of an NGO that came to build toilets. The community said that's not what they want, and basically push the NGO out of their community, which just feels like a very wasted opportunity for support based on just not listening to people about their own priorities. It sometimes feels really difficult to see how community prioritization is going to work in such a hyper-prioritized UN-led system. which certainly leads us to get quite excited when we start seeing pockets of that coming from elsewhere. Similarly, on community-led efforts, we had a lot of conversations about community-led and mutual aid initiatives. On the one hand, there is, of course, the story that community-led aid has existed since the dawn of time, and a lot of us are only now talking about it for the first time. There was, though, however, a sense that in a lot of places, particularly where aid was cut off quickly, there was a sense that community and mutual aid initiatives were kind of expanding and rapidly growing to try and fill some of those gaps. From conversations that we've had, a lot of those people and a lot of those initiatives tend to feel still largely invisible to and perhaps unsupported by formal humanitarian systems, which can ignore or undermine them. We ask people often also in crisis what sort of support they have provided in their communities rather than just received. There's a small graph here from DRC where you see most people are helping their own community in crisis. In Gaza also, we've been tracking how people have been helping each other and with what. And something that's been sort of hard to witness has been that people's desire to do that has not changed, but over the last couple of years, people's ability to do that has become really eroded. And as that is such a sort of fundamental part of their society, that also leads to other forms of hardship. Progress on local leadership. It seems that a lot of squeezed budgets are pushing more delivery to local actors, but this tends to feel to many people like outsourcing, not localization, is sort of a common refrain that we hear. We have a lot of feedback from local actors about this, as I'm sure that many of you on this call do, if you're not in fact living it yourselves. We hear in reality, we implement a project that the donor writes. Many see localization as being sort of co-opted to let international actors reduce risk, operate for a bit less money while still maintaining control. And there's not really a lot of evidence that local actors at any sort of scale are really influencing decisions over that sort of larger scale of a response. Which is a shame because it feels like there's been a lot of focus on this, and I know that there are, of course, pockets of progress. We spoke a lot about addressing conflict and violence, which is something that is very important to people in a lot of places where we work. Across every context, people were ranking peace and security as their highest priorities. These are things that humanitarian actors, in some ways cannot deliver, but in almost all cases are very vocal about the fact that they cannot deliver. But that also has implications for people feeling sort of abandoned or unheard when people who represent potentially international entities that work across both peace and humanitarian, governments who are maybe involved in wars but also providing aid. I think when that complexity is ignored by humanitarian actors talking to communities, those communities start to feel really abandoned, which leads to quite a lot of anger. And I guess, sometimes this doesn't have a quick fix, but I guess as we've put here, we cannot pretend to operate in a political vacuum. And I think the more that people take local leadership seriously, the more people are going to realise that that distinction is just increasingly impossible. So I guess moving beyond fragility and hyper-prioritisation, we saw 2025 was an inflection point between the centralised top-down system of the past and something new or something old that maybe hasn't been recognised in the way that it needed to. I think the funding crisis has done a number of things. I think it's woken a lot of people up to some of the fault lines, I guess, in the system. It also seems to be shattering the illusion of a single system. And, people are talking more about mutual aid, faith groups, social enterprise, diaspora. There seems to be a sense from many that one solution would be to shrink the delivery role of big international actors, have them sort of focus more on advocacy, norms, etc., and try better to break down the sometimes quite absurd silos between relief, rights, climate, economic justice, sometimes within a single entity. So it sort of feels to us, based on everything that we've heard, that there is quite a narrow window of opportunity, but that does require creativity, humility, and probably above all, a willingness for some to let go of power, so that we don't just end up with more of a slimmed down version of the same system. Ground truth data, both a kind of remark and sometimes a criticism that we get, honestly, is that a lot of our feedback that we hear from people doesn't change very much over time. That's not really on us. I think that's because it's a symptom of a sector that sort of refuses to change the way it works, despite having consistent evidence that a lot of this stuff isn't working. So I would encourage people to read the report, or maybe read one of the many reports that the big bumper report was based on. I know that a lot of the complexity was sort of whittled down from that presentation, but I think you get the gist. And as we all sit with that, as well as sitting with the very moving poem that we heard from Peter, I guess we want to sort of discuss now, how can we work differently? How can we sort of make sure that we're making a new future of solidarity and not breaking it in a world that is well and truly on fire? So with that, I'm going to stop talking, which I'm sure you will all appreciate, and hand over to our wonderful panel. And I'm going to start with, I won't do introductions all at once, just so they don't get lost. I'm going to start with Talatu. So I am thrilled to introduce Talatu Adiwu, who is the research lead at FACT Foundation Nigeria. Dr. Talatu is a great friend of GTS. She is also an associate professor of painting with a PhD in fine art. And with FACT Foundation, she leads research with communities across climate, humanitarian, community, and development contexts. Welcome, Talatu.
You very much for having me. Hello, everyone.
Now,
I hope I'm audible enough.
I want to start with, I have to say, I get a bit confused sometimes about what prioritization actually means. And today I checked the hyper-prioritized GHO to see what OCHA thought, and I'm no less confused. So I looked at Nigeria, and it said, there are 8 million people in need, of which 2 million are prioritized. And so therefore there's a call for $900 million, but really it's less than that because the hyper prioritize is 300 million, but we're not going to get that anyway. So I thought I would just go straight to the source. What do you see as someone who is not only living in Nigeria, but, studying the situation there and talking to people all the time who are sort of living on the front lines of crisis? What do you see following aid cuts and prioritization in Nigeria?
Well, Meg, I can say that we're both joined in the confusion about prioritization, because really, what do you mean prioritization in an environment that everyone should be a priority, right? But I would like to say that prioritization commits or presents itself in two ways, right? Two ways from the perspective of the community itself. What do they see as a priority for them? Because they are on the ground, they are the ones facing what they're facing. And then also prioritization means something different for the humanitarian system in its own way of doing things. So for me, I have observed that community priorities haven't changed. The slight changes have only been in communities that have begun to experience some kind of stability. Then you see the shift from wanting food and cash, health and medicine, shelter for household recovery or flexibility. They begin to make calls or begin to prioritize livelihoods, empowerment, such that they are now in like control of how they earn, how they take care of themselves, how they are able to provide for their families. And basically, it's their own way of feeling that they are now back in control of their lives instead of constantly having to look outward for, assistance or how to feed or how to drink or how to do basic things in their lives. So that is how prioritization has shifted in terms of, the community perspectives. Areas where they are still facing difficulties, facing still a lot of conflict, a lot of dynamics, consistently remain the same. It's all about food, it's all about cash, because this is what makes them flexible. This is what makes them able to access their basic needs. This is what makes them feel some degree of normalcy in, the very difficult situation that they've found themselves in. And safety and protection is often really, really expressed. This is one of the core things that communities have begun to prioritize more and more in areas that have remained unstable. But it presents itself in different ways in the Nigerian context, right? Because of the narrowed budget or the narrowed area of operation that we have, or the system that we're now currently operating in, it presents itself in terms of coverage contraction. Fewer locations, fewer communities or LGAs as we call them, are being reached consistently. And even those ones that are being reached consistently, you will see that there's a significant reduction in how many households are being, assisted or supported. And these assistance are increasingly given in shorter and shorter cycles, or they're basically maybe intermittent, less predictable than they were before. Another way it presents itself is in terms of package thinning, right? What was previously obtainable was you would see that a package would cut across many sectors, cash, wash, NFIs, and so on and so forth, and give in some aspects of protection, some aspects of outreach, some aspects of psychosocial support. But now the focus is more on giving survival packages and for a fewer number. Even organizations that previously were in terms of a lot of soft skills support are now changing their trajectory, because it seems that with the shrinkage of aid and the shrinkage of funds, people are beginning to think that it is more important to give communities that need cash so that they can make the decision themselves, and less about what do they really need, what would really be of help, what is the nature, how is the environment, how would it determine what their priorities are? So because it's much easier to give the survival packages, that seems to be the line which most humanitarian organizations seem to be doing these days. Also, there's a hard triage. The practice of hard triage becomes very normal, meaning that decisions as to who gets support, it's now tilted towards severity. So the more severe this area is, the more the tendency for us to, provide support in that area. And also, it's about access. Operational footprints bias, really. Despite the fact that there are many areas that have high levels of vulnerability, levels being reflected and reported, but because of the narrowed down budget or the narrowed down space that organizations are operating on, they tend to shift their concerns or their attention towards places that already have a footprint, despite the fact that those places already have like enormous footprints of support, diverse support going on. So there's a tendency for them to go to areas where there's a lot of humanitarian visibility, because what that does is that it helps them to manage the funding that the narrow funding that they have. So what has that done? What has the aid it has changed who is visible, who is considered to be vulnerable. As I've mentioned, footprint bias, right? Even though they are hard to reach areas with a lot of vulnerable people, but because it will cost more to set up in that particular area, and access to this particular area is more difficult, we have a tendency to lean towards where it's less difficult for us to access, and there's already a footprint that we can just, build on. So what that has done is that people who are increasingly more vulnerable are becoming more invisible, right? And who is reachable is now based on a financial decision, not really based on, the fact that this person needs to be reached. And then also who is believed to be a priority is now a very subjective, argument, really. It's, yes, I know that you do need my support, but, the funding in which I'm operating on within only allows me to, access this area and so on and so forth. So basically, in summary, these are the things that we are seeing. In terms of the community, the priorities remain the same, right? With an increased call on livelihood so that they can experience more autonomy. With the onset of more stabilities in certain areas, there is less about food and survival and all of that, and more about sustainability. But then with the cuts in the aid, it is all about how best can we use the limited resources and less about the humanitarian aspect of it, in my observation. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a quick follow-up question, because as you were talking, it sort of struck me that, these are things that we hear in a lot of places, that the humanitarian sector is sort of focused on easy to reach areas, and that there seems to be a widening gap between prioritization and what is being delivered, and that less is being delivered. Are you seeing other people pick that up, in some of these more hard to reach areas? Are we seeing, as we see maybe in places like Somalia, an expansion of community-led mutual aid? And is that maybe having a different impact?
Yeah, I would say so, because when you're used to receiving external support, and then suddenly the external support is no longer existent, and then there's no clear communication as to why you are no longer able to access this support. And there isn't like any clear communication as to whether this support is possibly going to come back. You turn inwards, especially in hard to reach areas where the stability is very, very dynamic and very, very volatile. You see that are turning now to themselves, forming groups that are gender-based, age-based, and just rallying around themselves and trying to see what they can do for themselves. You can see of contributory support where maybe weekly or monthly, people within the same age group or within the same gender group make contributions that go towards helping a particularly vulnerable person within their community. You see religious centers or religious worship centers making announcements that there are certain needs within this community, and however small you can provide the support, then the community would take the lead on how they can distribute this to make this support provided. You will see that there are pockets of instances in some hard to reach areas where I've visited that individuals that have had some level of education begin to provide some soft capacity, livelihood and empowerment trainings within their environment using the small knowledge that they have. So yes, there is that turning inwards, trying to do things for ourselves. But then there's still the consistent call that if we do get the external support, now not in terms of aid, but now in terms of reinforcing what we are starting to do for ourselves, this will really go a long way. This ties into the areas where I've mentioned begin to call for livelihood support. It ties into wanting external support to reinforce their feelings or their attempts at autonomy, their attempts at, making a living for themselves, their attempt at wanting to provide and to be able to stand on their own feet. Yeah, so these things reflect themselves, but the reason why it's not as visible as possible is because these are pockets and these are things that are being done from a very limited, very scarce resource environment. Hence the call for, okay, if you would not give me food, you would not give me cash, you would not give me health and medicine, but whatever it is I am doing, are there tools, are there better ways that I can do this if you can provide those kind of supports? Yeah.
Thank you so much. You've painted a very clear picture there, I think, of kind of community action, but also, I guess, struggle. We also can't fully see you, which I think makes you seem even more wise because you're sort of behind this fog. We'll come back to you in a minute, but I want to now go. I want to now go to Patrick. So Patrick Gathara, many of you will know, is a journalist, editor, political cartoonist, and writer. Having worked as a cartoonist and columnist for Kenyan and international publications for more than 25 years. Does not look old enough for that, but that's a separate subject. And he is now the senior editor for inclusive storytelling at the New Humanitarian. I think some of you may have seen his podcast and his articles on decolonizing reporting. Welcome, Patrick.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. I'm now wishing my camera wasn't working as well.
You talk a lot about narratives, and this is something that I'm quite passionate about. We actually have at Ground Truth, changing narratives is one of the 5 pillars of our strategy. But I have to say, it was a bit of a battle to keep it in there, because I think it's sort of a word where a lot of people say, oh, what does that mean? That sounds a bit fluffy. You know, you're obviously, Patrick, very passionate about this. Based on the sort of picture presented in this report, and I guess what you have been looking at in terms of crises for a number of years, how do you think that we need to change narratives around aid and solidarity to sort of better serve people who are facing crises?
Thanks. I think it's really an important question. I think the prominence of narratives and the preeminence of narratives is something that people tend to dismiss. But how we understand the world is really through the narratives we tell. And narratives are really these collections of stories and the background understanding that they create. That's what is the narrative. It's not the story itself, not just which stories we tell, but it's how the totality of those stories, our idea of reality that it builds. I think in a sense, the humanitarian sector and the reporting on the humanitarian sector has tended to create a narrative that centers the formal humanitarianism, what I might call the Western-based humanitarianism, as the default humanitarian, the default way that the world responds to crisis, that people around the world respond to crises. Either they are giving, in which case there are people in the West or in the global North, or they are receiving, in which case they are people in the global South. There's a dichotomy that's been created where we start to understand the world as bifurcated into these spaces, into these areas of competence that are in the West and the areas of crisis that are in the South. But all this kind of has not ever been true. It's just been the stories that we've been told that has created this idea in our heads. In 2019, ODI put out a report looking at essentially how do communities around the world, what are the resources that they get, when they're in crisis. And that report showed that what we call international humanitarian aid amounts to less than 2% of the resources that communities, even in the worst crisis, have. 2%. So why is it that our idea of aid is the Western worker in his blue, whatever, windbreaker? Why is it that we see humanitarianism, the picture of humanitarianism, as being the neighbor, as being the person in the diaspora who sends remittances, as being the government worker who provides service? Why is that outside of our scope of understanding humanitarianism? And this, again, is being driven by narratives. you know. And I think what's happening now with now to go to the report and with the cutting of aid is really a moment of revelation. It's really we are getting a shrinking of the formal humanitarian aid sector, and that is then revealing what has already always been there, which is people working with their neighbors, people helping one another, people coming together in crisis, and we are now enabled to see it. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no consequence to the shrinking of this wider system. Of course, it has caused lots of pain, and in the abrupt way that it has been done. And the fact is, for a long time, people did become dependent on its existence, but it never replaced the systems of solidarity, the systems of people working together, of community within crisis, that have always been there. And I think that's a really important point to keep in mind when you're telling stories. That we have to start not thinking that this is new, but that this is something that has always been there. People have always worked together to help one another and to create coping mechanisms. And I think that also then when we start thinking about what comes next, we have to understand sort of about recreating what has sort of this shrinking system, And the question should be, how do we actually get that not to be the center? That we see that these people within the crisis, are we center them? And it goes to the question you'd asked about priorities when you're prioritization. You're talking to Talatu. Who's doing the prioritization? Communities themselves know what they need. Lots of times they have ways of actually going about this. And can we get a formal humanitarian system that doesn't see itself at the center, but sees itself as plugging into the humanitarian systems that already exist? That providing that these resources are not coming in as, oh, we are the ones who are coming in to help, but we are coming in to plug in into how you guys are already helping yourselves, and working within those systems. I think if you look at, for example, what happened with Sudan and the emergency rescue rooms, one of the things that I found quite saddened about is immediately the formal humanitarian system saw what was happening. They started urging them to sort of formalize, become NGOs, plug into our system, become like us, professionalize in a sense. Rather than working the other way, this is something that is indigenous, that's local, that's working. It's already there. So we should be plugging into them. And in fact, I would be saying rather than them writing proposals for funding, we should be writing proposals for how we fund them, and let them decide this is how we want to do it. That is the shift that we want. That's the shift that should happen. And when we talk about localization and power, my fear has always been that we want to recreate small pockets or more local pockets of what already exists, of this system that is already not created to deal with or to understand the ethics and the foundations on which local humanitarianism works, but we're trying to then take it from Geneva and superimpose it on what's in Kakuma or in Nairobi or in Khartoum, so to create sort of these smaller bits of Geneva everywhere, rather than question the existence of Geneva. And one final thing I think is a lot of times, again, our idea and our understanding of humanitarianism has been mediated by the stories that a lot of times are told out of the West, and has come with this underlying, I guess, philosophical basis of charity. That it is about the more fortunate helping the less fortunate. It is this sort of feel-good thing that you do. But in lots of spaces, if you look at humanitarianisms that are outside of the Western framing, that are indigenous, a lot of them are based on obligation, on what do you owe people? What do you owe somebody for belonging in this community? What are the things that you are expected to do. And that does a lot to get away from these ideas of who's in power and this sort of power imbalances that, in fact, the whole idea of charity, of us being on top, and helping somebody who's below, and I think that keeping all that in mind, means that when we are rethinking how we rebuild both humanitarianism and the narratives around it, we should be thinking that perhaps we don't base it on this idea of charity, on this idea of giving to the poor, etc., but on what do we actually owe our fellow man for being in community with them, what do we owe people for how do we recreate community rather than maintaining this top-down thing. Sorry, I'll stop there, and I've spoken a lot. I'm sorry.
No, thank you so much. And it really, as you were talking, it really struck me that I think you said something like, that we should take this opportunity to sort of change the narrative away from this stuff. Doesn't really seem like that's happening. If you look at some of the rhetoric that's coming out of the United Nations at the moment, which is, we are going to save this many lives. And I think it's interesting because there's kind of two realities. There's this sort of we're swooping in and saving lives, and then there's everything else that goes on in a crisis context. And I remember seeing something that you said, I think it was maybe at an ODI event or something, and you said that people are surprised that people are getting married in Gaza, I think was what you said. And I remember just feeling so sad that you felt you had to say that, and that so many people sort of felt that really struck a chord with them. Because we've all been kind of so socialized to say, here is a savior and here is someone in need, and maybe someone having a wedding or celebrating something doesn't fit that box that they've been put in as someone who is suffering. I was wondering if, I think we want to convey that crises are bad because they are. And yet in humanitarianism, we don't often want to name the causes. And I wonder if that sort of leads to people if all the badness is then put with the people, experiencing the crisis. So then this sort of language around victimization comes in. Would you kind of agree with that diagnosis? And I guess, what do you see as a way out of it, if even in this moment we don't seem to manage to kind of break some of these stereotypes?
I completely agree. I think that there has been a general sort of a very reductive telling of crisis and how crises happen, and that sort of kind of feeds into this idea that there's just places that are peopled by but guys who are incompetent. They just cannot handle the stuff of life. It's always flooding. They're always fighting. They're always angry. Instead of us saying how we've got a system, an international system that has progressively stripped people of their ability to cope, and that even within that, these people are still, doing stuff for themselves. And I think starting to point out what are the causes of this, how do we get to this point, then would lead us to a wider discussion than many humanitarians are actually comfortable having. It would lead us to talking about, the structure of the international system. Why is it that Africa, which is seen as this recipient of endless aid, is actually a net creditor to the world? And how do we live with that reality and still say that we are saving lives when actually in the spaces that we are, they are being supported by the extraction from those very people we say we are saving? If we can't start sitting with those inconsistencies and contradictions and actually working through them, then we will tell very, very different stories about what needs to happen. In fact, it would no longer be that we are saying to somebody in the West, send a few dollars here. We might be telling them, actually write a letter to your politician, say that this law has to past. This treaty has to be changed. etc. We would actually be dealing with the real causes of vulnerability rather than sort of reducing it to this sort of charitable feel-good thing that it has become. And one final thing, I think that uh, when we start understanding that our creating a system that is based on obligation, that we think about ourselves as part or as being in community with the very people who are in crisis, we start seeing them as fellow human beings. So the thing of Gaza, that's what, for me, I remember one of the stories I told people was my first time in Somalia. I was riding in Mogadishu. I was riding in an armored vehicle, and I looked outside and I saw somebody selling tomatoes, and my head was like, "Who sells tomatoes in a war zone?" But it occurred to me much later on, I'm ashamed to say, that actually the problem wasn't that guy. The problem was my idea of what a war zone is like. That I did not see this as places where people live and people learn to live and people learn to organize. I had bought into the whole reductionist thing. They're either always fleeing or they are always cowering in some tent, and something. We do not see the life in there. And that's why I think when you mentioned in your report that, people are being treated almost as if all they do is eat and drink. We don't see the life around them. People who keep pets, we don't hear those stories. And so the narratives that we end up with are these really reductive ones, of what these people look like and how they live, and stuff. And we are not encouraged to see them as the same as ourselves, with the same desires, the same ambitions, and stuff. So we diminish their humanity just because they're in a crisis. So I would suggest that changing how we talk about these places and how we talk about the reasons why these places are would go a long, long way in readdressing that imbalance.
Thank you so much. And as always, a lot of food for thought and also a perfect segue to our next speaker. I'm really happy to introduce Fanta. So Fanta Toure is Resilio Fund's first CEO. Resilio Fund, if you haven't heard of it, is aiming to transform how the world responds to crisis by making local communities the heart of the response. Fanta started her career working in humanitarian relief at the grassroots level, so is very passionate about this topic, and previously was the director of the Girls First Fund. Fanta, welcome.
Thank you, Meg.
Now, we've heard a lot about some of the problems and some ideas about how we get out of this mess. And I would say no pressure, but you are in the business of sort of backing solutions and really trying to address some of these things through your work. So trying to root these solutions more in ideas of solidarity and community leadership. The report sort of ends on this comment about how it seems to be a make or break moment for global solidarity. How do you see this moment? Do you see it as a make or a break? And what do you think is kind of the path forward?
Thank you for including us as Resilio in this conversation, Meg. And also, I really want to salute Brown Trust for the way this conversation even is being organized, like being in the room with Peter and, in a way, inviting us to remove our professional hats, our platform, and connect as human about what's happening in this moment, I think is critical. And Peter, hearing you speak actually got me thinking about this quote that is usually in the back of my mind. And so I'm going to read it as I start responding to your question, Meg. And it is a quote by Arundhati Roy. She's a powerhouse in India. And she says, another world is not only possible, she's on her way. Maybe many of us won't be here to greet her, but on a quiet day, if I listen very carefully, I can hear her breathing. And this to me is taking me a little bit to what Patrick was saying. The short answer to your question, Meg, is that I think this is a make or break moment for traditional aid. And I think it is time to decenter traditional aid in the conversation. I think everything that is, there's something happening in the world, in the universe, however you want to call it, that is applying a magnifying glass to everything that matters right now. And I think that it is very painful. We're bleeding going through this process. But the truth is also that even here in the United States, you're seeing it. You no longer have the luxury to deny that certain things that marginalized communities knew were true, their truth was different from the other truth. You can't lie anymore. Just as a traditional humanitarian, you can no longer pretend that you are neutral. You can no longer say that you don't see how aid is being politicized in Israel, by Israel in Gaza. And I think these were some ugly truths that we had to face so that in traditional aid, we can question ourselves and interrogate what we are doing, those of us who are still pretending that we're here to save, and understand that if we're here to serve, then our positioning really needs to change. And we need to start looking at the world not from our perspective of perhaps sometimes coming from the human imperative of I want to help my brother, but really look at it from the perspective of the brother slash sister who is trying to reckon with their situation, trying to deal with it, which also takes me back to what Talatu was saying earlier. Nobody wants to receive aid. People, we are all born with this dignity, this innate sense of we matter. Nobody wants to be begging. People want to take care of themselves. They want to thrive. And they have been doing it. They have been doing their best before some forces and settled them. And so the real question for me now is if there's an invitation that we can take or leave, but an invitation of how do we step into this world that is existing and how do we support them best? And we can get to that in the other part of the question, but it's been interesting to me. And before coming to this space, I was working in the gender justice space. And so it's been interesting to me to watch the excitement about mutual aid in the humanitarian aid space. And I'm like, excuse me, but mutual aid is what my father was doing. That's what people do in the village. That's what feminist movements do. The woman who's taking care of her kids, of the neighbor kids, this is what we do. So why are we all excited about this? Like we're inventing sliced bread. We're not inventing anything. And I think our role becomes how do we support them? How do we, and not us trying to do what we normally do, which is figuring out now how do we appropriate mutual aid? How do we scale it up? Mutual aid is already operating at scale because that's what humans do. My neighbor's house is burning. I'm gonna run and figure out, is the cat out? Is the child who can't really walk, is he out? That's what we do, right? So I think it's the invitation now is what do you need from us and from the communities that we're here to serve, not to save, to tell us we need this from you to organize us, and then we come in support to it. It requires that we understand the system that already exists because that system exists. How does the system works? How does it operate? Where can we support with better connection? Where can we support with better resources? Never delivering, just supporting what is happening. And there I see a role for the private sector. I see a role, and again, not the extractive private sector that's coming to get its own, but the private sector that already exists, and then figure out how we can move in more solidarity and community with each other.
Thank you so much, Fanta. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because I live in a very small town with a lot of activist types, and they talk about mutual aid all the time, And when I start talking about humanitarianism, I think they find it sort of just constantly confusing. That so much of humanitarianism just looks the way that it does in this sort of big, I don't know, monotonous kind of way of working. But it's sort of you answered my second question a bit already, because I wanted to ask you about sometimes when you talk about community-led solutions, or the fact that, various community members are sort of always helping each other in crises, and what they really need is a bit more support and a bit more solidarity. You always hear this word scale. And your response to that is it's already happening at scale. And I guess the response of, say, a donor who finds it easy to put funding into a big UN agency would say, fine, maybe it is at scale, but it's so complex and it has so many diverse moving parts that we don't know how to properly support it, or, whatever the sort of critiques would be. Um, what's the sort of What's the response to that from you in terms of the work that you're doing, and what other people can do to sort of properly support something that maybe they can't always see properly, and maybe they don't need to, and it doesn't all need to come together in a nice package with, a new adoption of a fancy data system and start looking like a big NGO so that people will trust it?
I think so. Mutual aid already happens at scales, and when there's a crisis is when it becomes the most visible. It gets activated more. And it has very extensive networks, local, diasporic, etc. What is not yet happening at scale is support to mutual aid from non-community sources, and in community sources of, I think, diaspora. And so I think the question for us sitting for outside is, how do we support mutual aid at scale without hurting it? And then after we shift our position, and I mean in terms of listening more so that we can answer this question, there are again some human things that we have to impact. How to be more courageous in what we support, who we support, and we need courage to let go of control. And there are something deeper than that, actually. I think there's misbeliefs about who holds knowledge that is guiding what we call due diligence now, and that is actually a manifestation of control. So there is some kind of work on social norm change that needs to happen, right, in the traditional aid sector, and I don't know how you make that happen. And now having met Patrick, I can see how there's a narrative change work, intentional work on narrative change that has been missing, and that has its part in it. I think there's work to do around reviewing notions of what risks is. Really, the person at risk is the person who is at home being bombed or doing their work, and the organizations that are working the closest to it. So what are we really risking when we're supporting mutual aid at scale is another one. And this is going to be very selfish, but I can't help it. Being on this panel is another one of the things that have made me realize how privileged we are at Resilio, and how fantastic it is to have this platform that is unapologetically coming with a spirit of learning and with a spirit of resourcing community-led response. And we are not alone. There are others who are doing similar work. And I really want to encourage philanthropy to continue being the quote unquote risk taker in this moment and continue investing in, I don't want to call it the future because it's very present, but in like joining what I think is the new bandwagon in figuring out how to do this. The thing that I find interesting about philanthropy is that philanthropy is not both, it's the double-edged sword. Philanthropy is not disconnected from the private sector interests that are making this work necessary. But so if we can tap into the private sector connections and flip them and think about how we can make the silos disappear, you've mentioned it, Meg, and know that, as Talatu said earlier, um, it's not a relief versus recovery versus survival thing. This is a long-term game, and we have to think about how to tackle it all, how to support communities in tackling it all at once. Um, I think we will be on our way to figuring out something that we as traditional aid actors seems to struggle with a lot. And I'm not, I was gonna try not to say this, but it wants to come out, so I'll say it. I'm not thinking about the bilaterals. I think that we have fabulous friends working in bilateral organizations who really want this to be different and who know that it needs to be different. But I think that at least at Resilio, we want to do more talking in trying to shift people whose hands may be tied by real politic and political will, and then focus more on doing and showing a prototype that makes it harder for someone to say in 5 years, we don't know what communities want, we don't know how to support them, and things like that.
Thank you so much. Resonates a lot with us as an organisation who constantly tries to hear what communities want and then is constantly told that people don't have capacity to hear that. So a lot of solidarity there. Thank you so much. And I want to thank everyone for such, at times, poetic responses, which was a nice change from a lot of conversations that I've been in. We're sort of inching towards time. I know that Talatu is having an internet nightmare, but has managed to pop back. What I might do is just give each of you the chance for sort of a last word. Also, Peter, I think, has just jumped back into the chat. Just to sort of answer the question, you know, in 2030, let's not go too far into the future, what do you sort of wish would be different in the way that we had these conversations or managed responses to crises? Patrick, you're first on my screen, so I'm going to put you on the spot first.
So in 2030, what how I move forward? Is that a question actually? Before I start answering, before I think I was trying to read
Answer
on the
whatever
chat, so I
question you
missed the
want.
last part.
Yes.
So I think looking forward, for me there is a real urgency in starting to change how we think and how we see the world, and I think part of that, and for me the most really crucial part of that is how we speak about and how journalists and humanitarians and academics as well, how we talk about these spaces, because in the end, that's how much of the much of the rest of the world conceives of it or learns to think of it, you know, and it's the norms that we have assumed, the things that we have taken for granted about these spaces, and a lot of it has been discussed in this, are stuff that we need to change, and we need to tackle the idea of power, the idea of support. You know, I think for a lot of these communities, it's not so much support, help, aid, even those terms are themselves problematic. It's really we need to get out of their way. Is we've created systems that have made it difficult for them to respond to the crisis that they face, because we are constantly extracting from them. So in creating the crisis in the first place and removing from them the opportunities and the abilities to respond to it. And even when we do respond, we do it in ways that already undermine the systems that they have already created to work to address these things. So I think we need to get into this sort of mindset that actually it's about removing this international system that has been, a weight on their back for generations, that has essentially impoverished them. And if we are not talking about that, then all we will be doing is serving as a salve for it. Is essentially becoming a way of legitimizing the continued existence of an extractive and problematic system. The final thing I'll say is we need to be comfortable with complexity. If somebody says, "Oh, this system is too complex, I don't know how to plug it," go and ask. But don't expect the system to simplify itself for you. We have to learn that humanitarianisms and humanitarian traditions have existed across the world. They look very different in very different places. And if we want to go in and help, there's not going to be a one size fits all approach. You'll have to go and actually work with these communities, actually listen to them, and not assume that you can get, one cookie cutter solution that you will then apply across the board. Complexity is something we need to learn, that the world is complex. We can't reduce it in the case of journalists into like 800 words. You need to always accept it and not run away from it. And I think for us as storytellers, as communicators, the most important thing is to tell our people and tell our audiences that, look, it is complex. I'm not going to sort of try and present it to you as if it's this simple, simplistic thing with one solution. Let's just have 0.7% aid and that'll sort out everything. This idea, if all we did is take all of Elon Musk's cash and we gave it across, we could solve all the world's problems. That's bullshit. I'm sorry. It's the world is a complex place. It needs more than simply cash. It needs more than this sort of very simplistic approaches. So yes, be comfortable with complexity, seek complexity, look for it, and learn to live within it. Is something I would be saying. All right, sorry.
Thank you so
I
much.
talk a lot.
No, thank you. That's perfect. I've written down a couple of things you said as quotable quotes. My moderator job just got a bit more difficult because suddenly there's a flurry of questions in the chat after a very quiet session. So as I throw to the other panelists, if any of this strikes you as something you want to address, a couple of questions we've got that are quite good. One is, reform isn't working. More solidarity is clearly needed. It feels like stepping out of the existing systems is critical, and yet the humanitarian system has amassed a huge amount of power. So the question is not so much what should change as much as where could that power be redirected. And there was another question that's sort of linked from Chiyuki, who says, I want to know your thoughts about how can trust-based funding be established before or during a crisis. Fanta, Talatu, any of those tickle your fancy?
Maybe a little bit about the first, as to how the last part, because of my internet, I can't see the questions in the chart. So if you could repeat the last part about how power can be.
Yeah, it was more about if we accept that power is in the wrong place, but the sort of UN-led humanitarian system has amassed a lot of power, where should that power be redirected?
Well, I think that from our conversations between Fanta, Patrick, and even the poem by Peter, it's aligns that power should really reside with the communities themselves, right? If I'm not getting that wrong, because what we have all been saying is that aid in itself is not a foreign concept. It has existed in different complex forms, right? Patrick has emphasized the need for formal humanitarian systems to plug into those existing humanitarian aid systems. Because when you look at it in conflict situations, before the external powerful UN-led support reaches the ground, a lot has already been done by the regular people who are facing this crisis. So I think in terms of power, reasonably enough, it should reside with the community. It should reside with the people who really do face that. They should dictate the narratives, as Patrick has mentioned, that people engage with outside that reflects that. Because what we have been saying is that we focus on only that one part where there's a need, there's a need, there's a need, there's a need. But then when you look at it really granular with us that are already on this field, there's a lot of community resilience, even before any external support or any external power comes in to do that. And why isn't that community resilience the focus of what we are doing? Why aren't we driving it forward? Why aren't we making it about that? Why aren't we saying that before we arrive, the community has been able to do this and that, and thus we are keying into that so that these support that we're providing has a more sustainable grounding than what we currently do. Peter mentioned the fact that we are consistently doing the top-bottom approach. I think it's time for us to invert that. Let's see how we can begin from the bottom-up approach. What is already in existence? What can we do to make that the core? Because if you do that, really, after many years, it's different, and it could lead to, a better humanitarian system that is really community driven. So I think it's about shifting that power from the top and bringing it downwards and seeing how that reflects and how that changes, right? By amplifying community resilience, by amplifying, their systems that have been in existence for a very long time, and in all reality have actually been working and providing some sort of sustenance, right? I think that is where we need to be looking at and now in this, narrow window that we are approaching, because what we've been doing for so many years hasn't really been, giving us this, right? We have become desensitized, just as Peter mentioned in his poem, in his very powerful poem about using soft language. Because in my own corner, every time, to use a strong example, the recent 3 different explosions that happened in Maiduguri. I wasn't inside Maiduguri, but I was in another part of the country. And then when I spoke to people who were here in Maiduguri, and the picture I was getting was entirely different from what was being, heard outside of it, right? So there's this tendency for us to soften things that are really hard. There's this tendency for us to ignore the things that we are unable to make sense of, or we are unable to fit into our box. And I think that community resilience, that capacity of community members to do things for themselves is one of the things that we don't know what to do with. So we just brush it aside and think that what we have, right, is really the best thing. We're the most educated. We're really the ones that know how we should come in and assist you and do things. We're the ones that are telling you that this thing is the right way to go. It is not about how you see things. We're seeing it from the outside. We're seeing it from the aerial perspective. You're inside, so your view is skewed, right? Somehow. So I think that really shifting the narrative, shifting the power, shifting the operations from the top, and now bringing it to the bottom and seeing that, okay, formal, modern, educated UN-led, systemic, formal, all of these things haven't really produced the results that we're looking for. Why not approach it from the perspective of the people who are or have been in this situation for a very long time? Let us allow them dictate how they want to be supported. And let us just do that. Let us just support them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I have failed at timekeeping almost. So I just didn't want to cut anyone off. We're technically at time, but I would love to just hear a last word from Peter and from Fanta, if you have a concise final thought.
I do have a concise final thought, and what Talatu said really resonates, but there's just one layer that I want to add, right? I think the time has come, and again, Peter did a great job rooting it with his word denial. I think that we no longer have the luxury of denial, and that everybody has power. And the sooner we start to name it, to understand it, and then to figure out how to engage with it, the closer we will be to getting at creating the type of world that we want our grandchildren to inherit and live in.
Thank you so much. Could not agree more. And with that, the final word goes to Peter.
I'm really happy that we are having this conversation about prioritization. Here in Kakuma, it was something that was introduced sometime last year in August, and we're still feeling the implication of it and the human cost. And it is this rollout that that has become a sort of transitioning where you graduate from a certain category to the other category. And in that time, they had introduced prioritization and divided refugees into 4 categories. So that means the first and the second category gets aid, and the third and the fourth category were doomed to suffer. And over time, when you look at how it has been done, it leaves us thinking, if this research really was done by experts, then why do you get it wrong 90%? It leaves us thinking that could it be that the researchers came to the camp, which they don't usually do. We have this system where researchers from university like Oxford sent out research subject to some group of people called enumerators, a disturbing term, and you go to the community, ask all these questions, and the research is not community-centered research. So I think there should be more of community-centered research. And also it leaves me thinking that, could it be that they came to the community, took all this information and maybe threw it into a chat box, and it decides who get assistant and who doesn't? Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you so much. There's so much for us to go away and think about, and I won't try and wrap up because we're sort of over time, but I think an idea from each of you that I've written down. One, if this is being done by experts, why do we always get it wrong? Community-led aid is happening everywhere and it doesn't need to be scaled. It's already scaled. What is risk? Risk is the person being bombed, not the paperwork. And complexity is not an excuse, so go and ask. So I hope that we all go and ask more today and in the rest of our weeks. I want to say a huge, huge thank you to all 4 of you, Peter, Talatu, Fanta, and Patrick. Thanks so much to the GTS team who pulled this webinar together and worked on the report, and wishing everyone a good rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.